Have the health risks of moderate wine consumption been grossly overstated? Spoiler alert, oh yeah. How does moderate wine consumption reduce heart disease? Hint, it's not resveratrol. And what is the ideal amount and pattern of wine consumption for maximum health benefits? And how does that differ between men and women? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Tony Edwards, author of the new book, The Very Good News About Wine. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover how Tony's experience as a BBC producer and a Sunday Times medical columnist shaped his approach to researching and writing about wine, why wine was prescribed in UK hospitals and by physicians during the Prohibition era in North America, why Tony believes the glycemic index is more accurate than the calorie theory for measuring food values, the impact of alcohol on your insulin response, what research shows about the benefits of dry wine for diabetics, the most challenging aspects of synthesizing decades of research on wine and health, why your ability to detoxify alcohol is at its lowest in the morning when many tasters believe their sensory abilities are at their highest, and how the J-curve demonstrates the extent of the health benefits of wine and heart health and diabetes. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 309. 3 of you are going to win a copy of Tony Edwards' terrific new book, The Very Good News About Wine. I also still have 2 copies of our guest's book from last week. That would be Behind the Glass, The Chemical and Sensorial Terroir of Wine Tasting by Gus Zhu. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 5 people randomly from those who contact me. If you haven't won a book yet, now's your chance. And keep listening, as my goal is to offer lots more books and prizes with every episode. Just email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In other book news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, or listening to the audiobook, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/309. Today's topic is one that is close to my heart, liver and pancreas. I've been following the studies about wine and health for the past 20 years, since tasting wine is my profession and drinking it is my passion. As a woman, I know that wine impacts my body differently from men. As a wine writer, I've always questioned myself. Am I bringing more pain or pleasure into the world? Am I enabling a dangerous habit, a potential addiction, or am I sharing the drink of conversation and communion? Well, the only way to sleep at night is to believe the second, but I am encouraged to know that solid science-based evidence supports that view. Okay, on with the show. From 1973 to 1994, Tony Edwards worked as a producer at the BBC on science documentaries in the UK. He has won numerous awards for his work, including 2 from the British Medical Association. From 1995 onward, he moved away from film to work as a science and technology journalist for publications such as The Sunday Times and Reader's Digest. He began to concentrate on medicine, writing for a variety of publications, including the celebrated magazine What Doctors Don't Tell You. In 2013, he published his first book on alcohol called The Very Good News About Booze, catchy. And in 2023, he followed that with The Very Good News About Wine, which we'll be discussing today. And he joins us now from his home in rural Kent, which is about 50 miles south of London. Welcome, Tony. It's so great to have you here with us.
Very good to be with you. Thank you.
Cheers. All right. Before we jump into our discussion, I want to note that neither Tony nor I are doctors, so none of what we discuss should be interpreted as medical advice. This is meant to be for informational purposes only, so please consult your medical professional to determine how much wine, if any, is right for you. All right. Tony, you have a story about tasting wine at 11 in the morning. Maybe share with us what happened.
It went very badly. Now, I'm a man who can hold his drink very easily. We might get back to this later on, but of a night, of dinner time, I'll have at least half a bottle of wine, at least, and sometimes more. And I can easily hold that. However, I went to a wine tasting at a local vineyard about 20 miles down the road last year or so, and it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and they were inviting us to sample their white wines. White wine's quite big in southern England now. To my surprise, and they give a tiny little glass this size, but I started to drink, and I just had a little sip at it, and I immediately felt woozy. I mean, really woozy. And it was, it was enough sip to sort of better to drown a fly. It was a very, very small amount of alcohol. And I thought, hang on, there's something wrong with me. And then I thought, hang on, there isn't something wrong with me. There's something really right with me. Because one of the problems that alcoholics have, or one of the reasons that people go into alcoholism, is because they drink in the morning. And in the morning is the time you get the biggest hit from alcohol, because alcohol gets detoxified at different times of the day, called circadian rhythms. In the early morning, your ability to detoxify alcohol is at its lowest, and it gradually increases throughout the day. So by the time dinner time comes round at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, your enzymes, your detoxifying enzymes are at their fullest extent. And that's how you can manage to drink a huge amount of stuff as I do in the evening. So it's fantastic. The other interesting thing too is that Mother Nature gives us a craving for alcohol at that time of the day when it's most able to detoxify it. So in the evenings, 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, we tend to, they call it wine o'clock, don't they?
Yes.
Oh, I must have a drink, yeah.
I call it Mommy's Little Helper. I used to.
Yeah,
I try not to make those jokes now, but anyway.
But it's because Mother Nature wants you to drink. It gives you a craving for drink at that time of day, because it's actually that time of day, the very time of day when your enzymes are able to detoxify the alcohol most efficiently. So it's what I think, we live in a wonderful world, and here's another example of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. I had never heard that before, and I love it. I love it that it's not just because I'm hangry, or it's what I call the arsenic hour, when you want to take arsenic or administer it to those around you. There's a reason Mother Nature equipped us to deal with alcohol then. All right. So how did your experience as a former BBC producer and then a medical columnist for the Sunday Times and other publications shape your approach to researching and writing about wine?
At the BBC, one of the reasons I had to leave rather early, I took early retirement, was because the programmes that I did were generally anti-establishment. I found lots and lots of reasons to question scientific orthodoxy. And it was okay in the 70s and 80s because we'd all come out of university being radicals. And I gradually found that the people who were coming into the BBC and becoming more senior to me were sort of casting a snook at the kind of the stuff I was doing, which was basically anti-establishment stuff. So I had to leave, took early retirement. So many of my programs were very anti-establishment in the sense that I questioned the scientific dogma.
And was that about alcohol while you were at the BBC?
No, about lots of things, including psychic functioning.
Oh.
Telepathy and others.
Oh, telepathy.
Telepathy, etc., clairvoyance, which of course science said was complete rubbish. But actually, in the 1980s in California, a lot of work was going on behind the scenes, secret work by the CIA and the Department of Defense using psychics to spy on Russia. That was classified information. I didn't know it then, but I was able to film the declassified information research. So, I mean, you had, on the one hand, science saying it's all rubbish. It must be, the idea that you can communicate with each other to telepathically or clairvoyantly see at a distance has to be rubbish, because we know consciousness is within the brain, and therefore it can't be anywhere else. That's an example of a film I was making, the kind of films that I made that were anti-establishment. And my colleagues eventually got fed up with me, and I decided I had to leave. So I then went into medical journalism ultimately, where I did the same thing, finding differences between what the orthodox medical profession was saying about the evidence and challenging it where necessary. And I did a lot of articles on cholesterol and statins and salt, all of these things that were said to be bad for you. And then I did an article on calories. And I was quite skeptical about the calorie theory anyway, because it seemed to me very crude.
The calorie theory being what?
Calories in, calories out.
The body as a furnace, burning those calories, yes.
And so I stumbled upon the fact that although alcohol is very high in calories, almost as high as fat, and yet research showed that people who drink do not put on weight. Through the calories, they may put on weight by the more food they ingest from actually while they're drinking, because it gives you the munchies, but the actual alcohol itself does not put on weight. And there are loads of experiments on animals and human beings showing precisely that. If you substitute food calories for alcohol calories in a controlled condition, you will lose weight.
I'm surprised to hear that because, a lot of diets say kick the wine or whatever at the beginning, and alcohol is an easy fuel to burn. I don't know, maybe that actually underscores what you're saying rather than disagrees with it. So maybe we can clarify a little bit. Just correct me. I dropped science early in high school. But food is measured on the amount of glucose or sugar it produces. And the glycemic index indicates how quickly a particular food raises blood sugar levels compared to pure glucose or sugar. Bread has a glycemic index of 100. Beer, though, has maltose, another form of sugar from wheat or barley, has a glycemic index of 89, whereas a dry wine has a glycemic index of 0?
Correct. The glycemic index is the alternatives theory to the calorie theory. In my view, it is the one which is most likely to be correct, because what glycemic index, as you say, measures is the glucose production of particular food. And it is glucose that gets stored as fat if you don't actually use the energy. So clearly that's a much better mechanism than the calorie theory, which, as you mentioned just now, burning food. They actually measure calories by burning the food in a little container called a calorimeter. So on the understanding that the body is like a furnace, you put coal in it, and you'll, etc. But, it's absolute nonsense. Clearly nonsense, because if that was the case, then we'd all be eating coal to put on weight, because coal is not biodigestible. Anyway, so it's a completely nonsense. And so even today, the calories are worked out by putting a particular food into this bomb calorimeter, which is so antiquated. It's sort of 19th century pseudoscience.
Right. And the body reacts differently depending on how the food was processed. And, we know that.
Well, of course.
Things like protein are, we actually burn more calories trying to consume it than we do, say, fast foods that are just don't take any effort to metabolize. Yeah.
Well, the glycemic index is the index that I use in the book, because it's, in my view, the one most sensible, because it links up the fact that alcohol doesn't put on weight, because alcohol has 0 calories in it. Sorry, scores 0 on the glycemic index. Absolutely right. 0. Whereas beer, you may talk about beer bellies, a lot of men have beer bellies. Well, that's because of the maltose within beer. And maltose is not actually 89, as you just said, it's 120. It's more glucose producing than sugar itself.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
It is very, very glucose producing. So wine has no maltose in it, as obviously we know. So this is why beer is very, very special, and why every culture knows that there's a beer belly. The Germans call it an abdo, the French call it an abdo-Krummenberg, and every culture knows that people who drink beer to excess get beer bellies. It's got to do with the maltose. And all of these things sort of tie up, making one recognise that the glycemic index is actually the only way to measure food values.
And as you say in your book, we don't hear about the wine belly. But some sources say, is this correct? The body will preferentially burn alcohol first before it burns fat that we've stored in our cells because alcohol is such a easy available fuel. Is that correct, or is that total bunk as well?
You're using the term burn, which goes back to the bomb calorimeter, the furnace thing. So actually, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. What is now clear is that alcohol itself is not bioavailable. In other words, the body doesn't recognize it as an energy source.
Okay. It just tries to process it and get it out.
To get stoned with.
Yes, indeed, which it's very good at doing. And just further background, insulin is secreted by the pancreas, which helps remove the glucose from the blood and deposits it into our cells, as you say, where it's stored as either fat or used as energy. What impact does alcohol have on the ability of our insulin to do this kind of conversion?
Well, the interesting thing about alcohol and insulin, which is why it's so good in diabetes, is it actually decreases the amount of insulin. Now, that sounds paradoxical, but the evidence is very strong that people who drink have much less risk of diabetes, considerable less risk. Now, why should lower insulin be a good marker for diabetes? Because diabetes comes as a result of insulin resistance, which is where the body produces too much insulin because it can't actually handle the turning it into glucose. So the body keeps on producing more and more insulin, and ends up with a state of insulin resistance, and then you get really full-blown blood diabetes. So the ideal is to have as little insulin as possible, because that means you have as little glucose, because the body is not actually producing the insulin to combat the glucose. It's a little bit paradoxical.
It is. But wine is not triggering glucose, and so therefore insulin isn't triggered to deal with the non-good glucose, if you will. Okay, cool.
Correct. And it's not just wine, it's all alcohol.
It's all alcohol, right? I've got a one-track wine mind, but yes, we should.
We all are.
And we should note that as we discuss these various findings that, we're talking about wine or alcohol in moderation, there are definitely negative impacts as you go into excess, but we'll get to that later. And so in your opinion then, or in the research, I should say, that you've discovered, then moderate wine consumption can help prevent diabetes?
Yes, it can. But heavy does the reverse. So in our conversation, we'll keep on finding this as a paradox. Little is good, moderate is good, too much is bad.
Like anything, right? Like water consumption can make you have hypertension because, raises blood pressure if you keep drinking to excess just of water itself. So
it actually blows your brains out too. Put water on the brain.
Wow.
That's how you die from it.
Oh my
Basically,
goodness.
It's too much water in the brain.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, be warned on water too. But since we're on this topic, for those who are already diabetics, is dry, we're not talking sweet wine, which does have sugar, clearly will trigger glucose and an insulin response. But for dry white and red wines or sparkling, is that quote unquote safe if there are no other contraindicators for diabetics to consume?
It's not only safe, it's beneficial.
It's beneficial.
A lot of studies have shown to. Oh yeah, you can reduce your.
It's reducing your insulin.
The same paradox.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So a lot of studies being done in Israel on this particularly. A small glass of red wine with a meal will reduce your insulin. Anyway, it's very good for diabetics, small amounts of alcohol.
All right. So what motivated you to revisit the whole topic of alcohol and health a decade after your first book, The Good News About Booze? You'd return and have this second book, The Very Good News About Wine.
Well, the first book, I thought, was a real kind of kick in the teeth to the medical establishment, because I showed very, very clearly that, as I've just discussed, small amounts of alcohol are very good for you, obviously where large amounts are not, while the guidelines were being increasingly reduced. I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I know the evidence, and I know it and everybody else can know it. This stuff is really good for you in moderation. Why are you reducing the guidelines to such a level that actually no one's getting any benefit from the alcohol? And that annoyed me more and more. And then the people, particularly in England, it was in Britain, on television saying there's not only no safe level of alcohol, there's no alcohol itself at any level is dangerous. And even people say wine is good for you. Oh no, she said, it's an old wives' tale. I thought, you're a bloody old wife yourself.
Not a childless cat lady. Never mind.
I mean, she was lying through her teeth. And so I thought, there's no point in rewriting the same book again. I'm going to concentrate on the second book on wine, where the evidence is really overwhelmingly positive in terms of its benefits for health. And so I got the old title, Good News About Booze, but very good news about wine. It's a slam dunk because it's so easy to show that wine is good for you. Time and time again, study after study after study shows this stuff is really good news. It really is good news for your health.
And you've differentiated between wine and other alcohols in various chapters in this excellent book. In fact, you cite over 300 medical studies in it. What was the most challenging aspect of synthesizing decades of research on wine and health?
I think the problem is a lot of the evidence is heterogeneous.
It's conflicting?
Not seriously conflicting, but some people say, it's very good if you take it an X amount. And other people say, well, we didn't find that. We thought it was X minus Y amount. Oh, we found X minus. So lots of different studies show different results. And so what you have to do is you have to synthesize all of the studies. Now, that's done for you quite easily because a lot of people do what's called a meta-analysis, where they pool together all of the information and come up with a synthesis of what the totality of the evidence shows. And so what I did in the book was because I do like my wine and I do want people to know that actually it is good for you, I have concentrated on individual studies where wine is good, really good for you. For example, French women and breast cancer. I was astonished to find that they not only don't get breast cancer when they drink wine, they reduce their risk of breast cancer. Now, that is what's what they call an outlier in the trade. It's an exceptionally favourable study in terms of wine and breast cancer. And
well, by how much? How much did they reduce their risk?
I think any amount, actually, was reduced.
I think any amount of consumption. Okay.
But any amount, but they had to drink regularly every day.
I see. Okay.
This is another interesting thing in the book, that the evidence is contrary to what the authorities say. They say, oh, just have one or two drinks a week and then forget it. The evidence is completely to the contrary. You really need to drink every day for maximum health. Little and often. I mean, it's extraordinary. So the guidelines are completely the inverse of what the evidence says.
Absolutely.
In the book, I have this. I'm very careful to say, study X and study XY showed really, these remarkably favourable results. On the other hand, looking at totality, there's this kind of outcome, and the outcome generally is in the same direction but more muted. So the meta-analyses on breast cancer and wine do not show that you will reduce your risk of breast cancer when you drink, 25 bottles of wine. They will not show that.
Right.
But the French data show that.
And do you think there is any risk that the French study might be biased because the wine industry is so important to France, even if the wine industry didn't fund research, which you found that consistently the alcohol industry is not funding this research. It's coming from governments and universities. But I think France, oh my God, if there's any bias, could it have been in that study at all?
I suppose, knowing Frenchmen as I do, I don't know many French scientists personally, but I know a lot of Frenchmen. And of course, they all love their wine. I suppose it's possible. These are, for example, work for the equivalent of the NIH. They're top-level scientists, an institution called INSERM. And you generally wouldn't find people at that sort of academic level fabricating the data. And they might have an unconscious bias, but you've got to really fabricate the data before you start. The answer is yes, of course, Frenchmen love their wine, and no, they don't fake their results.
I think you already answered this. I was going to ask, how did you check your own bias to avoid cherry-picking studies that sort of go along with your own love of wine? But you've already said you did focus on positives, but then you compared that to the meta-analysis, which would say, okay, this is a really strong positive result, and here's how it compares to many studies grouped together under this meta-analysis, so that it was always in the context of what's happening overall. Yeah, okay, good. And you used, for the difference, one of the big differences between this and your first book was Google Scholar. How did it help you write this second book?
The first book, it was a medical library, a big one in London, where I was allowed to Xerox papers after papers after papers for about $5 a day, ridiculously cheap. But since then, there's also a thing called PubMed, which did the same thing online. And then Google Scholar came along and allowed you access to every single scientific paper published since 1850.
Wow.
Every scientific paper in all fields,
Thousands.
in all fields of study, of science. It's unbelievable. And some of the time you can only get the abstract, the summary of it, and then you have to pay for the full paper. But by and large, they will give you the full paper, so you can read the detail of the paper. It makes making writing books like this a doddle. It also makes it easy for people to check up on what I've written. Because everything I've said is referenced. So, if you don't believe me, then go to Google Scholar, type in the reference, and you'll read it. It's very boring reading, but you'll find that I'm right.
Well, thank you, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, I think it is, Google. So for all their faults, that is quite a public service. Now, you mentioned in the book that wine was once prescribed in UK hospitals, I believe in North America too, by physicians during the Prohibition era when alcohol was banned. Why do you think they did that?
There was no science about it then, just doctors noticed it. The life assurance actuaries noticed that first in America. They saw that people who were regular moderate drinkers lived longer than people who weren't. So that was the first hint in about the 1920s. And then I think doctors picked up on that too.
Well, and I think there were a lot of patients who suddenly developed certain illnesses that were ill-defined, but they were confident could be healed with a prescription of wine.
And also, apparently, the churches were allowed to serve the wine, and so a lot of people became Catholics suddenly.
Lots of converts, I can only imagine. So we're skirting around this whole issue up till now, moderation. What is the ideal amount and pattern of wine consumption for maximum health benefits? Now, I know it differs by disease and by women and men, and we'll get into all that, but maybe at a high level, you could tell us.
The recent Czechoslovakian study of the whole database, about 2018, came to the conclusion that for men, the maximum optimum intake of wine per day was 60 grams. That's 2/3 of the bottle. And women, half that. That was the maximum optimal level. In other words, you can drink up to that level, and then beyond that, it starts to tail off. I'm not sure they're right, actually, because the Italians live a lot longer, drink a lot more than that and live very long. So that was looking at the totality, again, the meta-analysis, the totality of the evidence.
And maybe this is nitpicking or it hasn't been defined, but 2/3 of a bottle of 8%, say, low alcohol wine versus a 14 or 15% wine, does that make a huge difference?
Of course it does. Well,
okay. How does it change?
It's obviously the more alcohol within it, the more toxic.
Sure.
The more toxic it becomes.
How much it went up to? Okay.
Well, you can do the maths yourself.
Oh no, I don't do math anymore. Excuse me. I do. Yeah, science and math. Sorry, I shouldn't admit that. Okay, so what are the different? Okay, you talked about the differences between men and women in terms of what is moderation, 2/3 of a bottle versus half for women. We've heard various theories. Women have more fat or more water, less muscle than men. We're smaller, or we have not the right or fewer digestive enzymes. Is it a combination, or is there one factor there that makes the recommended dose, if you will, for women lower than men?
The major factor is the enzymes, the detoxifying enzymes. Now, why the good Lord did this, I don't know. You better ask him.
It's unfair.
But,
childbirth, too. I've got a bone to pick with him. It's clearly him. Anyway.
I mean, I don't think anybody knows, but these are the facts. Women have fewer detoxifying enzymes. And as I said, there's the body weight and the body fat and so on and so forth to take into account. But that's the major factor of the enzymes.
Just, it is what it is. All right. And do wine's health benefits differ in younger versus older adults and or our tolerances for alcohol as we age?
The evidence shows that actually the older you are, the more beneficial it becomes and the more you can tolerate.
The more you can tolerate. I hear people saying all the time, oh, now that I'm older, it goes right to my head.
However, for women, again, I've a lot of postmenopausal friends of mine have this problem. As soon as they got the change,
Okay.
they were stuffed.
Yep. All the fun went out of life. Yes. Great.
But in terms of the actual evidence for health benefits, the older you are, the more you can take and the more beneficial it is for your health.
Why is it more beneficial? Is there any sort of top line as to why it becomes more beneficial?
I mean, this is work from Denmark. The Danes are very, very big on alcohol research. They spend trillions of kroners on it, but I don't think they found out why. They just look at the epidemiological evidence.
Sure. Okay, let's get into heart. Before we dive into the relationship between wine or alcohol and heart disease, just want to share a few points about scientific study results for those of us who did not study science beyond high school. They're often reported on a graph that shows the relationship between two factors, as you do in your book, Tony, with the risk of getting heart disease increasing up the vertical axis versus the amount of wine consumption increasing as you go out along the horizontal line. You have a picture of that in your book?
I have pictures of this in my book, and I've done some drawings for your listeners.
Your own PowerPoint slides here. Okay, let's see. Oh, yes, there are the lines. There's the straight line up, meaning it would start at the lower left and go up to the horizontal right.
This is more risk of illness, death, longevity, whatever, and zero risk. For example, if you smoke, the more cigarettes you smoke, the number of cigarettes you smoke there, the more damage it'll cause, and the more risk of dying you'll have here, okay?
Right, yes.
That's smoking.
Okay.
And that's what the anti-alcohol people say about alcohol. They say the more alcohol you drink, there's no such thing as a safe level. They'll say, stick to that.
Zero.
However, the truth is...
PowerPoint slide 2.
Ta-da!
Oh, here comes that famous J-curve. I believe there you go. Okay, let me just say a few words about that. The J-curve, J-shaped curve, where initially the line falls, meaning, say, your risk of heart disease decreases as you consume more wine, then it gradually starts to rise at higher levels of consumption. J-curve, of course, is far more nuanced. And as I've demonstrated, not you, much harder to communicate versus that straight line of advice where the more you drink, the greater your risk, which is not true. So what about this J-curve? It's showing basically that there are benefits for heart disease with consuming wine up to a certain point. What is that?
So in other words, you have a decreased risk of heart disease. Say, an example of wine, so there'd be about bottle and a half of wine for men, roughly. So as you drink a little bit, say half a bottle of wine, you maximize your decreased risk.
Right, the lowest part of the J.
Yeah,
the dip
and as
down,
you drink more, and this is about a bottle and a half here.
Bottle and a half, you come back up to the zero as if you didn't drink at all.
In other words, there's exactly the same level as people who don't drink. So of heart disease.
All right.
And
so when it comes to heart disease, it's better to have some wine in moderation than none at all, at least according to the J-curve.
Absolutely. And diabetes, the same thing.
Okay, another J-curve. All right.
No, but it's mainly diabetes and heart disease with this very strong J-curve effect.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, so red wine seems to have the most health benefits due to the polyphenols that protect plants from disease and sun damage. These polyphenols also help us counter the free radicals in our own bodies that cause aging and disease. White wine has, I think, only 1/12 of the benefits of red wine. We always hear the story we heard the story back in the 80s or 90s on that show, 60 Minutes, the investigative television show. It was all about the resveratrol, and red wine sales surged. But how much would we have to drink to get the health benefits from resveratrol? Would we be dead?
My first book, I was very pro-resveratrol because the evidence was pointing in that direction, but mainly from one source, University of Leicester in England. And then the more I looked at it from the second book, the wine book, the more I realized that they were over-egging the pudding somewhat. And in fact, the totality of the evidence is you've got to drink an awful lot of resveratrol in order to get any health benefit from it at all. 20 litres, I think, to get some benefit, which is obviously unthinkable and undrinkable. In Alzheimer's too, they've found that resveratrol has an effect on Alzheimer's patients, but again, they've got to drink 10 times that. So that's sort of 200 litres to get the same amount. So what's now recognised is that it's the totality of the polyphenols in wine. It's not just resveratrol. They picked up on that first because the red wine has lots of it and white wine has virtually none. So they thought, it must be that. And a lot of studies, and they as a kind of group think about it. And I think the group think is now ebbing away. And the general opinion amongst these experts is that it's the totality of the polyphenols within wine, which are, red wine contains, 1,000 polyphenols, and it's the interaction of these polyphenols with each other that actually produces a beneficial effect.
And polyphenols are, of course, natural compounds. Do they include the color pigments and tannins and
all of that stuff?
Resveratrol,
yeah.
of course. And they're interacting with each other, but also it's also the combination with alcohol itself, right?
Now, that's the interesting thing. And in my chapter on zero alcohol wines, which is a brand new one for this book, I thought, well, I had just researched it completely blind. I had no expectation of finding what I did find. And Google Scholar, what has he got for us? And I was astonished. I assumed that having taken the alcohol out of wine, you'd at least get some benefit from the detoxification in there. But actually, the reverse is the case. In every conceivable area that they've done research on, they've done clinical trials on individuals in laboratories, giving them fake wine and real wine, alternating, and looking at the biomarkers of what, in urine and blood and so on, the kind of beneficial things that occur to work out whether these things are having any beneficial effect. I was astonished to read that every single study to do with heart disease, diabetes, blah, 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 showed that you have got to have the alcohol with the wine in order to have the beneficial effect. Zero alcohol wine is fine. If you don't want to get any benefit from it, fine, nothing wrong with it. But you will lose out on the benefits. So there's obviously some synergistic connection between the polyphenols and alcohol. And this is, it's a very exciting area of research. And they're only just working on this now. And I think in one of the questions you're going to ask me, you have asked it. Now, I think this area of research is going to be really fascinating to work out what that connection is between the polyphenols and the alcohol. This is a really mind-numbing discovery, really, because it's counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect it to happen.
Right. You'd think it'd be like drying out food and compressing it to its vitamin source. And you think, well, why aren't the vitamins still there? But it needs that active component of alcohol. Alcohol also delivers flavor. I think it's what enlivens wine. But, it's got the health aspect too. So for non-alcohol or alcohol-free wines, they're just neutral. We shouldn't expect the health benefits, but they're not like worse for us, are they?
Relatively, yes.
Okay.
Relatively speaking, because obviously, relatively to a moderate drinker.
Moderate drinking, yes.
Yeah.
So they're good for if you're trying to pace yourself and not go to excess on alcohol, like if you're kind of alternating maybe a glass with alcohol, without, or whatever. But sometimes, too, they can be high in sugar and additives and other things because they have to find some way to put in body and flavor when you remove the alcohol. So there is that, too.
In my chapter, I showed that actually some of the studies they've done in laboratories, some people refused to take part. They would not drink non-alcohol, zero-alcohol wine. It was disgusting. I've actually tried it. It is disgusting.
Yes, I have. Well, no, I found some. I have to disagree. I have found some good ones, and I do recommend them for those who are trying to pace themselves or, of course, can't drink because of all kinds of reasons. But anyway, but I am not a temperance gal. That's not me. So anyway, but that's fascinating. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Tony. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, have the health risks of moderate wine consumption been grossly overstated? Oh, yeah. As Tony explains, the alcohol consumption guidelines are completely the inverse of what the evidence says. His first book was a real kick in the teeth to the medical establishment as he showed very clearly that small amounts or wine, alcohol in moderation is good for you, whereas of course large amounts are not. While the guidelines were being increasingly reduced, he thought, this is ridiculous. Wine is good for you in moderation. And he wondered why the guidelines were being reduced to a level that actually no one benefits from moderate wine consumption. Study after study shows wine is good news. Number 2, how does moderate wine consumption reduce heart disease? Tony observes that it's actually a collection of polyphenols in wine that have a beneficial effect, rather than simply resveratrol alone, which itself is one of possibly 1,000 polyphenols in red wine. Of course, that's the reason why red wine offers the most health benefits. It's the interaction of these polyphenols with each other, along with alcohol, that produces the benefit. Number 3, what is the ideal amount and pattern of wine consumption for maximum health benefits, and how does that differ between men and women? Tony notes that a study in 2018 came to the conclusion that for men, the maximum optimum intake of wine per day is 60 grams, which is about 2/3 of a bottle, and for women, half that. Beyond that level, the health benefits diminish. Until then, the health risks escalate with immoderate consumption. The major differentiating factor between men and women is the detoxifying enzymes rather than body weight or composition. Women have fewer detoxifying enzymes. The evidence also shows that the older you are, the more beneficial moderate wine consumption becomes. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Tony, links to his website and books, the video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online no matter where you live. If you missed episode 5, go back and take a listen. I chat about wine and health with Dr. Edward Miller. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
We've suspected a relationship between alcohol and breast cancer for quite a while. And then kind of the big study came out in the British Medical Journal that said even an alcohol beverage a day increases a woman's risk of breast cancer. So there was understandably a lot of concern going on. There were concerns about that study, though, because this same group had previously reported that alcohol consumption adds years to people's lives, reduces cardiovascular disease. The more legit and more interesting, I think, to your audience is that, one, they didn't break it down by type of alcohol in the study at all. And so they said, please go back and do that. And when they did, this same study showed that when people drank 3 or more spirit beverages a day, the women had a 26% increase in their risk of breast cancer. And when they had 3 wines or more a day, there was no increased risk of breast cancer.
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Tony. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the surprising health benefits and risks of wine. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip tip question. If you'd like to win a copy of Tony's book or Gus's, I have 5 copies to give away. Or if you've read my book or are listening to it. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about wine and health. Did this episode help your understanding of the issues? Were you surprised about anything? Do you disagree with some of the points we discussed? Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to take a free online wine and food pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/309. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that has a high polyphenol count, or one that simply makes you happy. Either way, here's to your health. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.